The opposite can also be given out, don't be a child. That's usually kids who grew up on a farm or during the Depression or some situation where it felt like if you weren't working every minute, you wouldn't survive. You wouldn't have enough to eat. And so the parents get anxious if the kids are just being normal, natural kids. And so they tell the child something to do. My father grew up during the Depression and went to work in the 3rd grade. And he was a very smart man, and he self-educated himself through reading after that and developed his own business and so forth. But he had to go to work and stop being a child in the 3rd grade. So a lot of that can be cultural, yeah.
And my assumption is that was the message you caught, and that was your lived experience, that would get translated with the expectations of a child not to be a child.
That's right.
That's the sort of, right? So that it doesn't necessarily have to be because the social conditions are producing it in that moment.
Right, exactly.
Right? It can be just a continuation,
these
a
messages
generational
often
continuation.
get passed along through the child ego state. And the fear of, being a child or not achieving or whatever. Yeah.
I'm thinking about addiction in parents and the ways in which enabling plays a role in the child having to be a grown-up.
That's right.
Taking on that role in a lot of ways.
That's right. Yeah, good example.
Because a lot of cultures in the West are put children to work very early. Mm-hmm. And I think with the Children's Acts in this country and in my country, in the UK, that changed relatively recently, and I think we're probably still struggling to learn how to become a child, possibly because of that.
Right. Yes.
Firstborns very often get don't be a child.
Right.
And youngest children, which I was the youngest in my family, got the don't grow up. And what reminds me is that there's also a positive and a negative to these injunctions. You can make the best out of them.
Right.
I really made the best about don't grow up.
Another one is don't be important. That's where kids are to be seen and not heard. What the child thinks or feels is not significant. It's only the big folks' opinion that really counts. Another one is don't belong. Parents might say, we don't know where we got this one. The milkman must have brought him or her. And that's certainly a frequent injunction culturally for minorities.
And also military children.
Military children. Right. Yeah. Another one is don't enjoy. In some families, if you're having too much fun, you're obviously sinning. In other families, if you're having too much fun, you're obviously lazy, not getting your work done. So it's really interesting how we often, different people will get an injunction not to enjoy life.
For don't be important, I heard the examples, but I didn't hear what the main point was for don't be important.
What you feel or think is really not significant. It's only the authority figures that you're around who, what they have to say or think or whatever is important. And so people who have this injunction often won't speak up and share their opinion. And
the last one is don't. The last behavioral one is don't, which is like don't do any, like feeling frozen, right? And in terms of cultural aspects, some things I wanted to just say about this is that the don't be you is important to think about culturally. And I'm thinking about non-gender binary and how often there isn't permission to be different, to be on the spectrum, and so people are forced to choose. So that was an extension of that I've been thinking about a lot as I'm coming to understand that dichotomy we've set up, and how is it that when I'm born I'm okay the way I am. For some parents, and again thinking 3 or 4 generations back, how in fact do we hold this difference? And it will take, and so it's both wired into the script and sometimes into the brain. So how we undo this is going to be an important question. And also don't be you in terms of we have a concept called denial of cultural heritage, where I work in order to assimilate. I let go, being black doesn't matter or being a woman doesn't matter. So the whole way in which we can minimize our cultural heritage as a way to survive, and then it becomes part of our script. The other one about don't be close or trust. I know growing up in Rocky Mount, I caught don't trust whites until you know them. And so if I'm in situations where I get to know the person and understand the context, I am willing to be my full self. When I'm not, I tend to do a don't and just stay away. And then in terms of don't be important, I also, to Kumbo, I caught that in terms of not feeling like it was okay to say what I thought. When I went to the University of North Carolina in 1970, I was in all white classes, and I was coding it racially, and I had been taught to stay back, to not speak, and so I didn't speak. And that was a don't be important script that was cultural. I didn't have that experience in my all black school, but when I went into a different cultural context, I lost my voice. Yeah. So those are some examples of how it can play out culturally.
I have a different kind of acknowledgement and stroking for something in my family than other people have said, and that was humor. When I was humorous, my father particularly loved it, and my mother was also the straight person. She would laugh at his jokes, so it was a double positive for me to be stroked for being humorous.
Yeah, that's a nice example of a permission.
Yes.
Yeah.
And another thing is I got a very strong don't grow up. My mother was very competitive. She was very bright and married my father, who was not as educated as she was. And she also had to move from the East Coast to California because her brother was asthmatic or something, and he needed the warmer air. So she never got to really continue her education. So she was very insecure about that. And she was so competitive with me that I got a don't grow up because she wouldn't teach me anything she was good at. And she was very impatient. So that kind of fit her personality too.
Right.
These are fairly psychological concepts, and I'm wanting to connect it to like somatic experience of how that then actually manifests in something physical. And I'm thinking about the don't be well or sane piece, and I sometimes like to psychoanalyze my friends, even though I'm not in any, have any experience in therapy, because I have a particular friend who is sick a lot. Like if it isn't one thing, then the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and it's really surprising to me because I'm like the opposite of that. I don't get sick, and so. And as you described this idea of like, well, maybe it's also like where they got attention or where it is that they had and felt neglect in their childhood, like could that have been a way that they maybe got that attention? And so then I really like wonder like, could it be that psychological piece is so strong that it's showing up in their adult life in these really actual physical manifestations that, it's so deep, like to think that these illnesses and these ailments that keep showing up in their body can have such a direct correlation to their childhood script and stuff. So.
Graham and I participated in a epidemiological study that Martin Marks did at the University of Kentucky. It was about 40 years ago, in which we designed a health script questionnaire. And what we discovered was that we could give this questionnaire to incoming freshmen and predict with a great degree of accuracy who would get sick in their 4 years and who would not, based on the script messages they got.
And I also just like to say that it is absolutely true what is happening. And then we also do this, we have this idea of both and thinking. And it's also important that people discern that for themselves so that, that because it could also be genetic and come with the person, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to avoid not subtly blaming the person for those,
right?
For that. So that's the dance that we need to do.
There was a question
on the don't enjoy. I had a situation in my family where my we had 2 locations where we spent a lot of time, in the parents or grandparents, where the kids' parents grew up, or where we grew up. And when I moved out of state, I learned whenever we were in those places, we always had to work. We couldn't go out and do things and enjoy it. Mm-hmm. I learned when I moved out of state and had gone to college, moved out of state and had a career, I would orchestrate getting together with them at some other location, because then we would go out and have fun.
All right. So. Interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Do you talk about the decision later?
Yeah.
Because the injunctions is given, but we then decide how
Right.
we're going to live out the injunction. We don't have, like, if you get a don't be, doesn't mean you're still here. So somehow
Right.
or another,
I'm going to cover that.
you figured out. Or don't grow up. Well, I grew up. So we figure out how to get along, survive, given the injunctions that we get.
Right.
So in the slide with the circles and arrows, I see that the injunctions or permissions are indicated as coming from the child to the child, and I wonder if someone would be willing to explain that, because I don't quite get it.
It's how the parents are reacting emotionally to us in childhood that is the most powerful. You know, it's the old adage about do what I say, not what I do. Actually, the child will pay most attention to what the parents do, how they react to what the child's behavior is. So they're much more powerful than the verbal messages that are actually being spoken. Because our psychological survival and sometimes physical survival are connected with that.
I guess I don't understand why it's not a critical parent to the child.
Outside of awareness, it's the child ego state that is responding in the parent. So I'm sending a psychological message and a social message. The psychological message is from the child in me to you, if you were my child.
There are also a whole set of feeling injunctions. The first injunction is don't feel, period. That's where parents don't know what to do with emotions, so they just try to suppress them in order not to feel threatened by them. Second possibility is don't feel X. There may be a specific emotion that's defined as not okay. Don't feel angry, that's not polite. Or you're not being a good Christian, or whatever. Don't feel scared, you got to be tough if you're going to survive in this world. Don't be sad, that's being a sissy, whatever. And then the third possibility is don't feel what you feel what I feel. Some parents say crazy things like, I'm cold, go put on your sweater. You know, like the child is treated like they're an extension of the parent, and they're supposed to feel the same thing the parents are feeling. And then there are a set of thinking injunctions. Don't think, period, where the parent is wanting to do all the thinking for the child and not let the child think for themselves. Or don't think X. Mommy, is there really a God? Hush, don't ever let me hear you talk about that again. Like it's too threatening to even think about that. Or Daddy, who was that woman? Hush, don't you ever mention that again. So there are certain things that the child may say that they very quickly get the message that you don't think about that or talk about that in this family. In alcoholic family systems, you don't dare raise questions about your parents drinking. And then the third possibility is don't think what you think what I think. In very rigid families, there's an absolute right-wrong answer for everything, no shades of gray. And you're supposed to follow the party line. And if you don't, it's seen as a threat rather than adding a unique perspective or whatever. So again, what I'd like for you to do is on that matrix, just write down the ones that are most familiar to you underneath the lines, depending on whether they came from mom or dad or other caretakers or authority figures. And again, see what you come up with for yourself. So I want to go back to the matrix for a minute and talk about one other factor. That's called the program. It's the modeling for the parent, from the parent about how to carry out the injunction. Now, Steiner originally drew this from adult to adult. I don't think it's really adult to adult. In his example, it was. He was talking about the alcoholic script where the parents are saying, don't think, drink. And the example from the adult is, here's how to mix martinis. Well, the actual information about how to do that is adult, but the motivation is really coming from the little professor. And usually it's the little professor and the child that's modeling, like here's how not to get close, or here's how not to make it or succeed, or here's how not to grow up, and so forth. So I draw it as a line from the child to the child. So it's the modeling from the parent for how to carry out the injunction. So again, take a minute and think about any modeling, any programs that you got from your parental figures, either their adult ego state or their little professor, about how to do things. See what you come up with for yourself.
Could I just say about
Yeah.
this? This may help with the question you asked, Eugene, and I don't know if it will, and if it won't, know that we have part of what tomorrow is debriefing things that aren't clear. But if you look at this, you remember the P2, when we were talking about P2, the grown-up parent has the PAC, has the model for how to think, model for how to feel, and model for what's important. That's the C. So it's the parent. It's that C1, I think it would be. If we go back, that is representing in this script matrix. So it's the unconscious part or outside of awareness part of the parent.
Yeah.
I'm confused, so bear with me as I word my question. I'm trying to put it together with the different levels, the 4 levels that you were bringing up. I feel like some of the don't messages come from like cultural or institutional level. So
Right.
Are all the PAC also present in cultural and institutional level? And are we meant to like analyze it that way, or is that like too much of a stretch?
Well, Byrne pointed out that organizations and groups, institutions don't have ego states, but they have elements that function like ego states. Like on the parent level, there are a set of values that are passed along. On the adult level, there are technologies for how you go about doing different things. And on the child level, there are norms in terms of how you handle feelings and deal with emotional issues and things like that. So they do function in a way like the ego states, even though they don't have ego states.
And I think that's cool. And I also had the thought I had, and I don't know if I heard your question differently than Van did, but what I was thinking about was that, again, in my ego states are cultural messages at the parent, adult, and child level. So my child message was from the culture, as I mentioned, I think initially, or maybe it was in Monday, but it was, don't get angry because you'll get killed. So that was in my child, that was passed down, and I decided that in response to the culture. And it was coupled with the fact that my father had what I now know was PTSD from having been in World War II in a segregated army and came back to the South and couldn't go where he wanted to go because of segregation. So he had a lot of rage about all of that, which I saw which was passed on mostly non-verbally and behaviorally, but I caught that it was scary. So is that what you were speaking to also? Did both of those help? Okay, great.